So we've introduced the terminology, we've introduced the concepts of duration matching, we've introduced the rules to select portfolio assets to produce a duration match. We've also introduced something really important. There's risk involved in duration matching. While it is very low risk, it's not completely without risk. We've covered why the rules minimize those risks, but can't necessarily always totally eliminate. And very important, we've shown that it's not a one-time thing. You must continually rebalance the portfolio. So we're going to be digging into that, and we're going to be doing it through an example to begin to see some application of this. Let's take a very common situation where, for whatever reason, the asset and liability durations are not already equal. We have a mismatch. Then we will definitely have a risk to the surplus. We're looking at it in the example in terms of the BPVs, which implies we're looking at multi-period liabilities, which is the more common situation in the real world. If the BPV of the assets is less than the BPV of L, and if interest rates go down, that means the gain on the assets will be smaller than the increase in the liabilities PV, and the surplus would deteriorate, vice versa. So you have to look at the numbers, the differential, and think, what is the risk created by the mismatch in the BPV of A and L? Are we exposed to an increase in rate risk or a decrease in rate risk? That will be critical in determining what the right strategy is. That's a decision you will almost certainly have to make as part of solving a problem. We'll be doing it. We could adjust this, we could fix this, we can rebalance the assets. But what do we discover in the introduction? Liquidity in the bond market has substantially deteriorated, may not always be practical. So instead, we can use derivative instruments to modify the duration of the assets, and that is probably more common. In this module, we'll be looking at futures and swaps. We'll continue on in the next module and consider how swaption's really advanced technique could be used. I would recommend you focus on the use of futures and swaps. That's probably more common, more straightforward, and more likely to be what you would be asked for on the exam, just as some advice. It's also not unusual to not fully fix the gap because it could be expensive. If we do use derivatives, there can be practical issues, including the fact a lot of people are uncomfortable with derivatives. And the Institute's making that point. We don't want to just say, oh, fix everything. No, in the real world, there are issues associated with doing this stuff. So don't be surprised if they start talking about, we're going to do a partial closing of the gap. That, in fact, is very normal in the real world. Not because it's economically best, but because it may be practically best. Clients don't understand derivatives. They don't understand their accounting, reporting. They don't understand the cash flow. We already covered there are definitely risks associated in the derivative market. Rules can change and issues can come up. Calculations that you have to know. What is the duration gap? We use the absolute bar signs. The BPV of the A minus the BPV of the L measures the size of the duration gap. Well, when should I write BPA first? When should I write BPL first? You really should stop thinking that way. You should look at the differential. You should ask yourself which is higher or lower. Are we at risk at rising or falling rates? And then you begin your analysis from that point. What if they don't give you the BPVs? You calculate them as modified duration times value. A BPV means 1 basis point times 0.0001 is your delta R for a BPV. This is, of course, is also called basis point value or price value of a basis point. How could I close the gap using futures contracts? The number of contracts I need to buy or sell. We'll see how to decide whether to buy or sell is what is the change in BPV you desire divided by the BPV of the futures contract. What if they don't give me the BP of the futures? How do I calculate it? Take the BPV of the cheapest to deliver bond, underline the contract, divided by the conversion factor for that bond. They have to give you the data to get there using some combination of calculations. What if I want to do it using a swap? What is the desired change divided by the BPV of the swap? How do I calculate the BPV of the swap? What is the BPV of the cash flows being received? Add it. What is the BPV of the cash flows being paid on the swap? Subtract it. That will be the BPV of the swap. So let's dive right into application. We're going to go through a lot of the issues we introduced in the first module here in practical terms as well as the refinements. U.S. company has a lot of cash. They want to reduce their balance sheet leverage. They have a bunch of debt on the balance sheet. For whatever reason, they desire to lower the balance sheet leverage. The data for those bonds, in this case, look at the question, these are liabilities of the company. So these are the characteristics of the liabilities. Market value 150, modified duration 726, convexity 125.82. What is the BPV of the liability? 108,900. No excuses exam day. They could just go buy the bonds in the open market and retire them. Cash would go down, the liability would go away. The bonds are not liquid. They're held by buy and hold investors. You'd have to pay a big price to get them. We've learned the bond market is not terribly liquid anymore, particularly for a single bond issue, and you want to buy all of it. It's just not feasible to do that. There is a technique called defeasance, which is discussed in the reading, worth knowing it. You could construct a cash flow matching portfolio of government bonds as assets. Talk to your accountants. They will go through the legal steps. You can do what is called legal defeasance, which certifies that the characteristics of the asset cash flows exactly pay the debt, and you can in fact remove the assets you just bought from your balance sheet, the bonds you just bought, and you can remove those liabilities from your balance sheet. That is legal in a great many countries. It's called defeasance. Problem: government bonds have low yields, so they're expensive. You'll have to buy a lot of them. You're trying to retire corporate bonds, which have higher yield. It's going to take a lot of those government bonds. It is rejected as impractical. The cost is too high. So they're driving you towards, we're going to have to do duration matching techniques. Why do people do it if it's not perfectly easy? Because there are expenses in trying to do it other ways that may be too high. So 3 different corporate bond portfolios of assets are to be considered. They all have a market value of 150 or more. So we can't just say one of them costs more or less. We don't know that what's cheaper. They'll all be sufficient to pay the liabilities. So we can't make the decision based on that. All are acceptable at that simplest level of analysis. So here is your data. Select the right portfolio. What are the rules for selection multiple liabilities? It is not about modified duration. That's a distractor. When you have BPV, that takes into account the size of positions and is a more sophisticated and appropriate method. What do we need to do? We need to match the BPV of A and L. What's the BPV of the L? 108,900. What's the convexity? 125.82. So we want a BPV of A very close to 108,900, and we want a convexity of A a little in excess of 125.82. We don't want less convexity in the assets. So, these BPVs are incredibly close together. We want a little bit more convexity. One of these works. B. A doesn't work. When we look at the convexity, A does not work, C does not work, B does work. So what do we mean by a little more convexity? We mean solve this problem. There's no question what we need to pick. So don't try to look for a mechanical rule that doesn't exist. The question will be written, so if you know the rules, you will know what to do. We basically match the BPVs as close as practical, and we have a little more convexity than liability. We've applied the rules to identify the best portfolio for the duration match. That covered the last module, essentially. Sometimes later, we're looking at the portfolio, we've got to rebalance it. We need to collect new data. We have a new BPV of L, time and conditions have changed. We have a new BP of the assets we selected. We have a BPV of a future and a BPV of a swap. We can use either of those to make the adjustment. The swap terms are 4.6% fixed rate versus 90-day LIBOR. Look at your information. Focus here. We have a duration gap. So we need to close the duration gap. The difference there, that's the duration gap. And what do we need to do? We have too much BPV of A. So we need to lower the BPV of the A to match the BPV of the L. That's an easy thing to do. How do you use futures? When you buy a contract, it's more exposure to the bond market. It's raising duration. When you sell a bond contract, it's less exposure to the bond market. It's lowering duration. We must sell bond contracts. Calculate the size of the gap, divide it by the BPV of the future. That is the number of bond contracts you need to sell. Sell 26 contracts. Always round to the closest whole number. What if I need to use a swap instead? Let's go back. I need to lower the BPV of the A. What creates duration? Receiving fixed future cash flows. If you're receiving fixed future cash flows, when rates change, the present value of those future cash flows fluctuates. That's what duration is measuring. So if you want to lower duration and lower BPV, have less exposure to the receipt of future fixed cash flows. How can I do it with a swap? Let's get rid of fixed future cash flows. Let's pay fixed on the swap. Paying fixed on the swap will lower the BPV of your asset portfolio. Enter a swap to pay fixed. Make that decision first and then calculate the quantity of the swap using the formula. So we have the absolute value of our duration gap. The BPV of the swap was given per 100. They happen to give the BPV of the swap as per 100. They're telling you what you need to know so you can solve it. So we could divide that by 100. That tells us the amount of notional principal. We need 2.755 million notional principal. No excuses, must do, and know how to solve on exam day. Step one, do I buy or sell contracts? Step one, do I enter a pay or receive fixed swap? Then make the calculation of quantity. They go on to the practical issues. The company's not really familiar with this kind of stuff. They're nervous about the size of the derivative positions. It's not practical to buy or sell the assets to change BPVs. It's too expensive. They decide to tell the manager, look, let's compromise. Let's only fix 60% of the duration gap. And let's also look at some option type strategies to do that. Well, we're going to take a breather and we will continue that in the next module.